Get on your knees and wipe it up. It's about the only thing you're good for." The laughter came fast, the kind that had been waiting for permission. Courtney Bell tipped her paper cup sideways and let the coffee arc across the concrete, catching Ethan Cross across the back of his hand as he crouched to pick up a dropped pallet strap. He didn't cry out. He just pulled the hand back against his chest and stayed low, steam rising off the floor in front of him, while 11 people on the loading dock watched, and nobody moved. Nobody in that warehouse knew who the man in the gray uniform really was. If they had, not one of them would have been laughing. Ethan Cross started at Sawyer and Finch Distribution, Regional Center 14 off Battlefield Boulevard in Chesapeake, Virginia, on a Monday morning in March, badge number 4471, assigned to the overnight receiving crew on Dock 6. He was 36, quiet in the particular way that made people forget he'd said anything at all, and he never once corrected that impression. He drove a 10-year-old Silverado with a cracked windshield he hadn't gotten around to fixing, packed the same turkey sandwich every night, and said morning to everyone whether they set it back or not. Most didn't. The warehouse ran 400,000 square feet under sodium lights that never turned off, moving freight for 3 regional grocery chains on a schedule that didn't care whose kid had a fever. Ethan learned its rhythms the way he learned everything, fast, quiet, without asking anyone to notice him doing it. Which forklift had a bad brake? Which supervisor disappeared into the brake trailer for 40 minutes at a stretch? Which pallets got scanned twice because the software glitched on rainy days? He also noticed things a receiving associate had no obvious reason to notice. He read the safety bulletin board longer than the job required. He asked a shift lead once mildly why OSHA incident reports for Dock 6 seemed to route through the same supervisor who'd caused 2 of them. The shift lead shrugged and said that was just how it had always worked. Ethan nodded like the answer told him something. His partner most nights was Ruth O'Coffer, 58, 17 years on the floor, the closest thing Regional Center 14 had to institutional memory. She showed him where the good gloves were kept, which restroom actually had hot water, and how to read a supervisor's mood from across 100 yards of racking. On his 3rd night, she pulled him aside near the battery charging station and told him there were 2 people to watch. "Courtney Bell," she said, keeping her voice under the hum of the charger fans. "Shift supervisor. She's been chasing the ops manager job for 2 years, and she's decided the fastest way to look like a leader is to have somebody to boss around in front of people. Doesn't matter who, it matters that it's public." Ethan waited. Derek Voss, crew lead, good at his job, which is the problem, because nobody ever tells him no. He figured out a long time ago the cheapest laugh on this dock is making somebody who can't fight back look small. Ethan thanked her and went back to scanning inbound pallets. He didn't ask how she knew all that so precisely. He already understood she'd watched it happen to someone before him more than once, and that the warning was the only shield she had left to hand out. It took less than a week for both of them to find him. Courtney noticed him first on a Wednesday when he was breaking down cardboard near the employee entrance and she had to step around the flattened boxes in her steel toes. She stopped, looked at the boxes, looked at him, and announced, loud enough for the 2 associates behind her, that some people needed to learn the schedule worked around the crew, not the other way around. Ethan apologized and cleared the path. She waited until he'd finished before she walked through and made sure everyone saw her waiting. Derek found him that same night. Ethan had just finished stacking an empty pallet run when Derek walked by with 2 guys from the tailgate crew, dropped a crushed energy drink can on the ground he'd just cleared, and told him it was a good thing the company kept someone around for exactly this. The 2 guys laughed, because laughing was easier than not laughing. Ethan picked up the can. In their eyes, he was the perfect mark. Quiet, ordinary, no leverage, no rank, no one above him who'd notice if he disappeared. In a place where everybody sized everybody else up by what they could do for you, Ethan Cross could do nothing for anyone, as far as they knew. So it escalated the way these things always do when no one steps in front of it. Derek started timing his messes, waiting until he'd cleared a section before dropping a wrapper on it and calling it job security.
Ethan started pulling him off his lane during his 15-minute break to re-wipe a break table that didn't need it, standing over him with her arms crossed to see if he'd say no. He never said no. He did the work, said nothing, and drove the 40 minutes home to his daughter. Ruth watched all of it and said nothing either. She'd learned what happened to people who did. There was one thing about Ethan that none of them noticed because none of them thought to look. Twice a month on a Friday, he asked for the same 2 days off, always in advance, without any explanation. Twice a month, a plain government sedan idled in the employee lot at 5 in the morning to pick him up, and twice a month he came back Sunday night looking like he hadn't slept, said nothing about where he'd been, and clocked in for his shift anyway. Nobody asked. He was, as far as the entire warehouse could tell, just the quiet guy on Dock 6 who never had much to say for himself.
They had no idea what he did with those 2 days. They had even less idea what it was about to cost them to find out. The second Friday of Ethan's employment, at 6:15 in the morning, he was finishing the break room floor on the mezzanine level. He'd done it properly, moved the chairs, worked the corners, let the wax dry in sections. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and burnt coffee from the machine nobody ever descaled. He was crouched near the vending machine, wiping down the base, when the door swung open and Courtney Bell walked in with Derek Voss and 7 others coming off the overnight shift, mid-conversation, cups in hand. Courtney stopped when she saw him. She had a paper cup of black coffee in her right hand, fresh off the machine down the hall, still hot enough that she was holding it by the sleeve. She looked at Ethan. She looked at the wet, clean floor. She looked at the cup. Then she turned her wrist over. The coffee came out in one motion and hit the tile in a wide arc, and part of it caught Ethan across the back of his left hand and wrist as he was standing up. He jerked the hand back hard, reflex faster than thought, and pressed it against his shirt. The burn climbed up through the skin in a bright, immediate way that locked his jaw. Nobody moved to help him. Someone made a sound that might have been shock and might have been the start of a laugh. Courtney didn't apologize. She pointed at the spreading puddle with the empty cup still in her hand. "Get on your knees and wipe it up. It's about the only thing you're good for." Derek laughed first, one loud bark, and that gave the rest permission. 3 or 4 joined in. The others just watched, holding their coffee, doing the math on what it would cost them to say something, and deciding it cost too much. Ethan stayed where he was a moment, his hand still pressed to his shirt. Then he looked up and looked at their faces one at a time, not glaring, not pleading, just looking the way a man looks at a room he intends to remember later. He didn't raise his voice. He asked, "Are you sure you want me to clean it up?" The question landed strangely. It wasn't a threat and it wasn't a plea, and Courtney didn't have a category for it. She recovered in under a second and smiled. "Isn't that the only thing you're paid to do?" Ethan got down on the wet tile. He wiped it up while 10 people and their supervisor stood over him and watched, and when he was done, he wrung out the rag, dropped it in the bin, and walked out without looking at anyone. Ruth found him at the utility sink 8 minutes later, running cold water over the back of his hand. The skin had gone tight and red across a strip the width of 2 fingers. She said, "That needs a burn pad and an incident report, in that order. Go to Denise in HR, trailer by the west gate. She's decent. She'll actually write it up." Ethan kept his hand under the water and asked whether anyone had ever filed something on Courtney before. Ruth's face did something complicated. She told him about a tailgate worker named Marcus who'd reported Derek 18 months earlier and had his schedule moved to the worst shift rotation 11 days later, filed as operational need. She told him about a woman in inventory control who'd reported Courtney and been passed over for a lead position she'd already been promised twice in writing. "Nobody gets fired here," Ruth said. "That's not how it works. You just get made uncomfortable until you leave on your own, and the file says you resigned voluntarily, and everybody's hands stay clean." Ethan shut off the water and dried his hand carefully with a paper towel. He thought about walking off the floor that morning and never coming back, and how nobody would have blamed him for it. He clocked in again the next night in the same gray uniform, a burn pad taped under his sleeve.
He also did one thing that morning he told nobody about. He found Walt, the overnight security guard who'd held the gate for him more than once when his hands were full, and asked a favor. Pull the break room camera footage from 6:15, copy it, and keep the copy somewhere that wasn't on the company server. Walt looked at the sleeve for a long moment and asked if Ethan was planning to file something. "I'm not sure yet," Ethan said, "but footage in this building has a way of not being there when somebody finally comes looking for it." Walt made the copy before his shift ended. He started watching after that, not the way he'd watched before, the ordinary vigilance of a new hire learning a building, but deliberately, the way you watch something you intend to remember accurately later. He noticed who held the dock door for him when his hands were full and who let it swing shut in his face. He noticed which supervisors were decent to the crew when no one from corporate was walking the floor, and which ones only turned decent when a district manager showed up. A young receiving associate named Priya always shifted a stack of totes so he could reach the scanner without asking. A tailgate worker named Marcus, the one Ruth had told him about, never once looked through him like furniture, not even on the night everyone else did. Underneath the surface observations sat a harder question, and it was the one that kept him coming back every night instead of walking off the floor. Why had this been allowed to go on so long inside a company this size? Sawyer and Finch had a code of conduct laminated and bolted to the break room wall. It had an anonymous ethics line printed on every pay stub. It had an HR trailer with a real person in it. It had all the machinery a company was supposed to have, and that machinery had produced a room where a supervisor poured scalding coffee on a man's hand and ordered him to his knees, and 9 other people watched and said nothing.
Machinery that produced that result wasn't broken. It was working exactly the way somebody had built it to work. He started documenting it properly, not in a phone note anyone could scroll through, on a folded sheet he kept in his back pocket during his shift, transferred every morning into a file on his laptop before he slept. Dates, times, names of who was present. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, just a record because his father, a career Navy chief before he retired, had told him once that the difference between a complaint and a case was documentation. Denise Kowalski from HR found him in the parking lot on a Thursday morning, keys already in her hand, looking over her shoulder before she spoke, which told him a great deal about her position in this company. "I heard about the break room. I want you to know not everyone here is like that. I'm sorry it happened. I'm sorry I'm telling you that out here instead of doing something about it in there." Ethan told her she had nothing to apologize for. She said that wasn't true and left. He learned in 9 days of loading trucks what he'd never have learned in 9 months of reading policy binders. Overtime hours for the night crew routed through the same supervisor who approved write-ups, Courtney's direct chain. Complaints that named her or Derek arrived in the ethics line inbox, got logged, and stopped moving. He knew because Denise, without ever quite saying she was confirming it, mentioned a reference number she'd written on her own hand 18 months back for Marcus's complaint and how the attached statement had vanished from the file by the time she went looking for it 4 months later. Meanwhile, Courtney was already talking like the ops job was hers. She'd started referring to her shift in the future tense, telling a coworker in the break room that certain people understood how the game was actually played, said loud enough for Ethan 3 feet away with a mop to hear every word. Derek was louder and vaguer, telling the tailgate crew his numbers made him untouchable. Neither of them ever looked twice at the quiet guy on Dock 6 while they discussed their futures in front of him. It was that week Ethan stopped thinking of this as a story about 2 unpleasant people and started seeing the shape of something larger, a pattern of buried complaints, vanished overtime, and reassigned schedules that traced back through the same narrow bottleneck every time. He didn't have all of it, but he had enough to know it wasn't going to stay buried much longer. Derek escalated first because escalation was the only direction he knew. He stopped bothering with the pretense of accidents. He'd finish a burrito at the tailgate, wad the foil into a ball, drop it deliberately in a lane Ethan had just cleared, and time it cross at the dock whenever the floor was fullest. Courtney's method was worse in its own quiet way. She'd start sending Ethan to re-clean areas that were already clean. The mezzanine landing mopped the night before, a break table wiped 20 minutes earlier. She never pretended there was dirt. She just said the sentence and watch him kneel from a distance, arms folded. The point was never the surface. The point was that she could say 6 words and a grown man would get down on the floor. Younger hires started copying it, and that told Ethan more than anything else had. A 23-year-old named Bryce started leaving his energy drink cans on the racking instead of the recycling bin because he'd watched Derek do it and understood correctly that this was what someone with a future around here did. 2 new tailgate guys started calling Ethan the quiet guy among themselves, not with real malice, just the easy contempt of people who'd been shown that contempt was the local language. Cruelty didn't need a policy to become culture. It only needed the people at the top to model it once in public, without cost. Not everyone was the same, and Ethan made himself track that too. The ones who'd never joined in, because a man who only records the cruelty ends up with a false picture of the place. Priya, Marcus, Ruth, Denise twice, in a parking lot she didn't have to walk into. He was still deciding what to do with any of it when Courtney and Derek decided to move first. She caught him near the ethics line poster on a Tuesday afternoon, the same board with the reorg notices and the safety postings and the phone number that rang, he now understood, straight into the same department that buried everything else. He'd been standing in front of it maybe 30 seconds. She came around the end cap with 2 co-workers, looked at the board, looked at him, and smiled the way she always did when she had an audience. Don't strain yourself trying to understand things meant for people with actual jobs, she said. You just worry about your mop. One of the co-workers laughed. Ethan didn't answer. He looked at her for a second, not defiant, not bitter, something closer to patient, and walked his cart down the aisle. That silence bothered her more than an argument would have. For 3 weeks her whole method ran on one assumption, that people below her were afraid of her, and fear was the load-bearing wall under everything she'd built. She went back through it and couldn't find a single moment, not the coffee, not the kneeling, where she'd actually seen fear on his face. Calm wasn't the same as broken. She'd been reading one as the other since his first week. She took the problem to Derek over beers that Thursday. He laughed at first, told her she was losing sleep over a guy who mopped floors. She told him a guy who mopped floors had a badge that worked on every dock at every hour, and nobody thought twice about where he was. Derek stopped laughing. The plan they built wasn't clever, because in 2 years neither of them had ever needed one to be. They'd claim Ethan had been caught in the manager's office after hours, going through files he had no business touching. Derek would say he saw him. Courtney would file it herself, and because she filed it, it would move in a day instead of dying in intake like everything else did.
Ethan was called into the shift office at 4 the following afternoon. Courtney was already seated, a single sheet turned to face him across the desk. A termination notice dated that day, 1 line describing the allegation, a signature block waiting at the bottom. Derek stood behind her chair with his arms crossed, wearing an expression he'd clearly been practicing since lunch. "This is what happens," Courtney said slowly, wanting it to be the sentence he remembered, "when people forget their position." Ethan picked up the sheet and read both sides without hurrying while the room waited for him to say something about the accusation. He set it back down. "Is the base recall roster still going out tonight?" The question landed wrong, and Courtney didn't have anywhere to put it. "What?" "The recall roster," Ethan said again, evenly, "for the squadron out at Oceana. Is it still going out tonight?" Derek's arms uncrossed. Naval Air Station Oceana sat 20 minutes from the warehouse, and everyone in Chesapeake had grown up under the sound of jets breaking overhead, but nobody in that room had any reason to know what a recall roster was, let alone why a receiving associate on Dock 6 would be asking about one like it mattered to his Friday. Courtney recovered the way she always did, in under a second. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're being let go for cause, Ethan. Sign the form." He didn't sign it. He left the sheet on the desk exactly where she'd slid it, stood up, pushed the chair in, and walked out of the shift office.
Courtney sat there a moment after the door closed, and for the first time in 2 years inside that warehouse, she didn't feel like she'd won anything. The email hit her inbox at 5:50 the next morning, before she'd even badged into the building. Corporate Safety and Compliance would be conducting a site visit at Regional Center 14 that afternoon, accompanying a joint press and community relations event with Strike Fighter Squadron 106 out of Oceana, honoring reservists who also worked full-time jobs in the local community. She read it twice in her car. It said nothing about Ethan Cross, and that was somehow worse because it meant there was a version of today she hadn't accounted for. She'd seen reservists mentioned before, a line in the company newsletter twice a year, a photo of somebody in a flight suit shaking hands with the regional VP. She'd never once connected it to anyone on her shift. She went to work anyway and did the only thing she knew how to do under pressure. She demanded Dock 6 be spotless by noon, walked the aisles twice checking for stray pallets, and tried very hard not to think about a burn pad she'd caused 2 weeks ago. At 7:15, Ethan came through the employee gate in his gray uniform, pushing his cart exactly as he had every morning since he was hired. Courtney stood in the middle of the aisle and stared at him. She'd signed a termination form the afternoon before. Intake had logged it. There was no version of the process where he should still have a working badge. And yet the gate had opened for him, and Walt at the guard shack had said good morning, and here he was with his cart. Associates were already gathering near the dock doors, where a small stage and podium had been set up for the afternoon event. Folding chairs, a company banner, someone from marketing testing a microphone. 20 people, then 30, moving with the mild, nervous energy of people expecting something they didn't fully understand. Courtney made a decision in front of them all. If Ethan Cross had somehow slipped past his own firing, he would leave a different way, and everyone watching would understand exactly what it cost to make her look foolish twice. She grabbed a rag off his cart, took 6 steps, and threw it on the concrete in front of his feet. "You want to work here that badly?" Her voice came out higher than she meant it to. "Get on your knees, one last time, then get out of my building." Derek laughed from somewhere near the folding chairs, loud and relieved, and a few people near him made the sound people make when they're not sure laughing is safe yet. Ethan looked down at the rag, then he looked up at her, and this time he didn't move toward it. He just stood there, hands at his sides, and the refusal was quiet enough that the crowd took a full second to register that it had actually happened. Courtney turned toward the guard shack and told them to call security, her voice cracking on the last word. That was when the 2 black SUVs came through the main gate, and behind them a Navy staff car, and the whole loading dock went still at once. 30 people turning to watch, chairs stopping mid-scrape, as a man in a flight suit climbed out first, and 6 more in dress uniform followed him across the lot.
The email hit her inbox at 5:50 the next morning, before she'd even badged into the building. Corporate Safety and Compliance would be conducting a site visit at Regional Center 14 that afternoon, accompanying a joint press and community relations event with Strike Fighter Squadron 106 out of Oceana, honoring reservists who also worked full-time jobs in the local community. She read it twice in her car. It said nothing about Ethan Cross, and that was somehow worse because it meant there was a version of today she hadn't accounted for. She'd seen reservists mentioned before, a line in the company newsletter twice a year, a photo of somebody in a flight suit shaking hands with the regional VP. She'd never once connected it to anyone on her shift. She went to work anyway and did the only thing she knew how to do under pressure. She demanded Dock 6 be spotless by noon, walked the aisles twice checking for stray pallets, and tried very hard not to think about a burn pad she'd caused 2 weeks earlier. At 7:15, Ethan came through the employee gate in his gray uniform, pushing his cart exactly as he had every morning since he was hired. Courtney stood in the middle of the aisle and stared at him. She had signed a termination form the afternoon before. Intake had logged it. There was no version of the process where he should still have a working badge. And yet the gate had opened for him, and Walt at the guard shack said good morning, and here he was with his cart. Associates were already gathering near the dock doors where a small stage and podium had been set up for the afternoon event. Folding chairs, a company banner, someone from marketing testing a microphone. 20 people, then 30, moving with the mild, nervous energy of people expecting something they didn't fully understand. Courtney made a decision in front of them all. If Ethan Cross had somehow slipped past his own termination, he would leave a different way, and everyone watching would understand exactly what it cost to make her look foolish twice. She grabbed a rag off his cart, took 6 steps, and threw it on the concrete in front of his feet. "You want to work here that badly?" Her voice came out higher than she meant it to. "Get on your knees, one last time, then get out of my building." Derek laughed from somewhere near the folding chairs, loud and relieved, and a few people near him made the sound people make when they aren't sure laughing is safe yet. Ethan looked down at the rag. Then he looked up at her, and this time he didn't move toward it. He just stood there, hands at his sides, and the refusal was quiet enough that the crowd took a full second to register that it had actually happened. Courtney turned toward the guard shack and told them to call security, her voice cracking on the last word. That was when the 2 black SUVs came through the main gate, and behind them a Navy staff car, and the whole loading dock went still at once, 30 people turning to watch, chairs stopping mid-scrape, as a man in a flight suit climbed out first, and 6 more in dress uniform followed him across the lot. Courtney stepped forward on instinct, hand already half extended, arranging her face into the expression she used for district managers. The officer in the flight suit walked past her without slowing, without so much as a glance at the hand, and crossed the 30 feet of concrete to where Ethan Cross was standing, with a rag still lying untouched at his feet. "Commander," the officer said, and came to something close to attention. 30 people on that dock had no idea what they were looking at. Nobody moved. Somebody's phone slipped out of a hand and clattered against the concrete, and nobody bent to pick it up. The man in the flight suit was Lieutenant Colonel James Whitfield, commanding officer of Strike Fighter Squadron 106, and he was looking at Ethan Cross the way you look at someone you've trusted your life with at 400 knots. He glanced down at Ethan's left hand, at the fading pink line still visible below the cuff of his uniform sleeve, and something in his jaw tightened. "Who did that?" Whitfield said. It wasn't a question, not really. Courtney's face lost its color in stages. Derek stopped laughing so fast the sound cut itself in half. Whitfield didn't wait for an answer he already suspected he wouldn't get honestly. He turned to the gathered crew, 30 faces staring back at him with no idea why a Navy commanding officer had just addressed a receiving associate as commander. Lieutenant Commander Ethan Cross flew 22 combat sorties over the last deployment cycle, in and out of contested airspace in an F-18 Super Hornet, so that most of the people standing on this dock never had to think about it. He's a single father raising an 8-year-old on his own, and he works this floor on the weeks he's not in a cockpit because a Navy Reserve paycheck alone doesn't cover daycare in this county. He asked me personally not to say a word about any of it to his employer. I agreed to that until 3 days ago when I was told what happened to his arm. The truth landed on that dock in pieces, and each piece was worse than the one before it. The quiet guy nobody bothered to learn the name of, the one who took the worst shifts without complaint, the one who knelt on wet concrete in front of 10 people because a supervisor told him to. He had spent his 2 mysterious Fridays a month strapped into a jet worth $80 million, flying missions most of the people watching him now would never come close to understanding. He hadn't hidden it because he was ashamed. Ruth would say later, once she understood, that she thought he hidden it because he wanted to know exactly what this crew was like when they believed there was nothing in it for them to be kind. Ethan didn't ask for anyone to be fired on the spot. That was the part that changed the shape of the whole afternoon.
He walked back to his cart, took a plain folder off the bottom shelf, and set it on the podium meant for the press event. Inside it was everything he'd built over 3 weeks. reference numbers for complaints that had stopped moving, overtime hours that had vanished from 2 pay periods for 4 different names, a printed comparison of an incident report before and after it had been softened, 2 signed statements from Ruth and Denise, and a video file time-stamped 6:15 in the morning that Walt had preserved off the company network before anyone thought to erase it. He set his phone down next to it and let the video play once, quietly, for the compliance officer standing beside Whitfield. Nobody but that officer and Courtney needed to see it twice. "You're not sorry you did it," Ethan said to her, not raising his voice, the way he'd said everything for 3 weeks. "You're only sorry you found out who you did it to." He let that sit, and then he said the part that mattered more. "Your mistake was never picking the wrong man, it was thinking there was a right one." Courtney started to apologize, the words tumbling out about stress and misjudgment. Derek said it had been a joke twice, like repeating it would make it true. Compliance suspended them both within the hour, pending a formal investigation to be handled by an outside firm, not by anyone inside Regional Center 14 who might have a reason to look away. That evening, Ethan drove the 40 minutes home, picked his daughter up from Ruth's sister's house where she'd been staying, and made her the same turkey sandwich he always packed for his own shift, and neither of them talked about the loading dock at all. The investigation took longer than the suspensions, and it went further than Courtney or Derek had ever imagined it could. The outside firm pulled 2 years of incident reports and found the same pattern Ethan had already mapped by hand. Reference numbers that named Courtney or Derek routed through the same intake clerk, logged, and then quietly reworded before archiving. Marcus's original statement about Derek turned up on a backup server nobody at Regional Center 14 knew still existed. Word for word what he'd said 18 months earlier, nothing like the sanitized version that had made it into his file. The overnight overtime that had vanished from 4 different names across 2 pay periods was traced to a scheduling override Courtney had approved herself, always in weeks when her own numbers needed padding. Courtney and Derek were both terminated for cause 3 weeks later. 2 people in intake were let go alongside them, their initials on records that no longer matched the statements attached to them. Ethan wasn't in the room for any of it. He told the compliance officer the same thing he told Whitfield the day the SUVs pulled through the gate, that if the company only cared because the target turned out to be a pilot, they'd have learned exactly the wrong lesson. He wanted every case handled on the evidence, the same standard that should have applied when the person on the floor was Marcus, or the woman in inventory control, or anybody else with no rank and no uniform to eventually vouch for them. The compliance officer agreed and made it a condition of the whole review. The repairs took longer than the firings. Marcus got his old shift rotation back, along with back pay for 2 years spent on the overnight schedule he'd been shoved into for reporting Derek in the first place. The woman in inventory control got the promotion she was promised twice in writing, backdated to the date it should have happened. The ethics line was pulled out from under any single department and rerouted so complaints landed with an outside reviewer and the corporate safety office at the same time, so no one person could sit between a report and the people who needed to see it. Every overtime record for the night crew going back 2 years was audited and paid out with interest where hours had disappeared. Denise Kowalski was put in charge of rebuilding the HR process for the whole regional center, not because she'd known who Ethan was, because she hadn't, but because for years she'd kept filing reports that went nowhere and apologized to a man in a parking lot when there was nothing in it for her to gain by doing it. Ruth was thanked personally and tried, at first, to wave it off. Ethan told her she'd warned him about Courtney and Derek on his 3rd night when he was nothing to her but a new hire with a cart. She'd shown him where the good gloves were kept. She'd told him to put ice on his hand. She'd told him the truth about a company that had taken 17 years from her and never once asked what she thought about anything. And she'd done it without knowing a single thing about who he really was. That was the whole point of asking. Whitfield offered, more than once, to have the squadron's public affairs office turn the story into something bigger, a feature, a segment, the kind of coverage that made recruiters happy. Ethan declined all of it. He didn't want a story built around him. He wanted the ethics line to work,
And it did now, and that was the part he cared about. He kept working Dock 6 for another 4 months, through 2 more drill weekends nobody asked him about anymore, because now they knew, and mostly they just let him do his job. Bryce went back to using the recycling bin and never explained why. A couple of the newer hires started saying good morning first before he could say it to them. The burn on his hand faded into a thin, pale line that most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking for it. He didn't try to make it go away faster. It had taught him something no flight school and no company handbook ever had. You don't learn what somebody's made of by watching how they treat you when you outrank them. You learn it by watching how they treat you when they're sure you can do a single thing for them in return.
Courtney and Derek hadn't been wrong because they'd failed to recognize a Navy pilot standing in a gray uniform in front of them. They'd been wrong the moment they decided a quiet man with no rank they could see was someone who deserved to be humiliated at all. Dignity was never something a uniform handed out. It was something you either gave to people who had nothing to give you back, or you didn't, and everyone on that dock eventually found out which one they'd been. 8 months later, on a Saturday in November, Ethan Cross stood at the edge of a gymnasium at Georgetown Elementary in Chesapeake, holding a paper plate of cupcakes he'd definitely not made himself, waiting for the second-grade reading fair to start. His daughter, Maya, was across the room, arranging a poster board about sea turtles, glancing back at him every few seconds to make sure he was still there. He hadn't missed a Saturday like this in 4 months. That was new. For the first 2 years after her mother left, Ethan had built his whole life around a spreadsheet. Drill weekends on one column, warehouse shifts on another, Maya's school calendar wedged in wherever it would fit, and somewhere underneath it all, quietly, the exhaustion he never let anyone at Regional Center 14 see. He'd taken the overnight shift on purpose because it let him be home when Maya got off the bus, even if it meant running on 4 hours of sleep most days. Nobody on the floor had known that either. It had never occurred to Courtney or Derek to wonder why a grown man wanted the overnight slot so badly, because it had never occurred to them to wonder anything about him at all. That had changed, not overnight, and not because anyone made a fuss over him. He still would have walked out if they had. It changed because the floor itself changed. Denise had pushed through a shift bid system that actually accounted for parents on the crew, something that hadn't existed before because nobody who wrote the schedules had ever needed it to. Ruth had started running an informal Tuesday carpool for 3 single parents on the crew who all needed to be somewhere by 4. None of it had Ethan's name attached. He had asked specifically that it not. Whitfield had approached him twice more about doing the public affairs piece, and twice more Ethan had said no, until the squadron's family readiness officer mentioned, almost as an aside, that 2 other reservists at Oceana with young kids had started asking for flexible civilian scheduling because they'd heard secondhand that it existed somewhere. He agreed to one thing after that. A short interview, no cameras, no mention of the coffee or the termination notice or any of it, just an explanation of how a warehouse shift and a fighter squadron and a single 8-year-old could actually fit into the same life if somebody built the schedule to let it happen. It ran in a base newsletter nobody outside Oceana ever read, which was exactly how he wanted it. Marcus made crew lead that spring. He asked Mark, half joking, if he had any advice for the job. He told him the only thing worth knowing, that a schedule was never just a schedule to the people living inside it, and the day you forgot that was the day you started running the floor like Courtney had. Courtney never worked in logistics again, as far as anyone at Regional Center 14 heard. Derek turned up eventually at a distribution center 2 counties over, and the story reached Ruth through somebody's cousin that he'd lasted 4 months before a similar complaint got him let go. Evidently, the ethics line worked there, too, or he simply hadn't learned anything at all. Nobody on Dock 6 spent much time thinking about either of them anymore. There wasn't much left to think about. Maya's poster took second place in the reading fair, a fact she announced to Ethan 4 separate times on the drive home, each time as if it were new information. He listened to all 4 tellings the same way, because that was the whole point of any of it. Not the cockpit, not the folder full of evidence, not the afternoon the SUVs came through the gate.
Just this. A kid in a booster seat, talking too fast about sea turtles, certain her father was listening. He still kept the faint scar on his hand uncovered most days now, not out of any particular meaning, just habit worn down to nothing. Occasionally, someone new on the crew would ask about it, and he'd give them the short version, burned it at work once a while back, and let it go at that. The important part had never been what happened to him on that floor. It was what the floor became afterwards for the people who were still standing on it long after he'd clocked out for the last time and driven home to the only job that had actually ever mattered to him.